In a Serbian city in the fall of 1941, German soldiers walked into a high school, pulled 12-year-old boys out of their seats, and lined them up in an open field to be shot by machine guns. Their teachers walked out with them, voluntarily, to die beside their students. By sundown, nearly 800 people were dead. Not soldiers, not resistance fighters, civilians, workers, children, Roma kids who shined shoes on street corners, men who had never fired a single shot at anyone. And the reason every single one of them died, a math equation, a formula with human lives as the variable. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists to make sure history like this is never forgotten, never buried, never allowed to repeat itself quietly. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Every video we put out is another chapter of history that deserves to be remembered. Now let's open the file on Kragujevac. Tichy fell April 6, 1941. Before sunrise, the people of Belgrade woke up to a sound they had never heard before. More than 600 German bombers tearing through the sky. No warning, no formal declaration of war, just fire from above. In the first hours alone, over 4,000 civilians were buried under rubble. Entire neighborhoods became mass graves before breakfast. Hitler had given the order to erase Yugoslavia's capital, not just as a military target but as a symbol, a punishment, an example. At the same time, the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria, closed in from every direction simultaneously. Yugoslavia's military, already fractured by internal ethnic divisions, collapsed faster than almost anyone thought possible. Units that were supposed to be defending borders were turning their weapons on each other. The kingdom was being ripped apart from the inside while it burned from the outside. 11 days. That's all it took. On April 17th, the Yugoslav government signed an unconditional surrender. 11 days and a sovereign nation simply ceased to exist. Its territory was carved up and distributed among the occupiers like spoils at an auction. Serbia, the heart of the country, was placed under direct Nazi military administration. It became, in every practical sense, a prison colony. The walls were invisible, but the guards were real, and they had orders to shoot. Tici formlano rititan on a load. What followed the occupation of Serbia was something that went beyond ordinary military brutality. The Nazis were looking to break not just the body of the resistance, but the soul of an entire people. Because Serbia didn't break quietly. Two armed resistance movements emerged almost immediately from the forests and mountains. The Chetniks, royalist nationalists fighting to restore the monarchy, and the partisans, a disciplined, ruthless communist guerrilla force under Josip Broz Tito. Together and sometimes separately, they made the German occupation a nightmare. Bridges blown up, supply lines sabotaged, German officers assassinated in broad daylight. The occupiers never felt safe. Berlin's response was not to send more troops to fight the fighters. It was to threaten the unarmed. On September 16, 1941, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, with Hitler's explicit authorization, issued what became known as the hostage reprisal decree. The language was bureaucratic, the meaning was monstrous. For every German soldier killed by the resistance, 100 Serbian civilians executed. For every German soldier wounded, 50 Serbian civilians executed. Read that again, not arrested, not imprisoned, executed. Shot! For the crime of living in the same country as people who were resisting an illegal foreign occupation. Keitel's decree didn't frame this as collective punishment. It framed it as a transaction. The blood of Serbian civilians was a currency. German military failures would be paid for in Serbian lives. Human beings had been converted on paper into dead instruments. This wasn't a field commander improvising. This was official Reich policy, issued from the top, signed by the man who would eventually stand trial at Nuremberg for it. Th General Duduoci VNGH Gansi. 3 days later, on September 19th, Adolf Hitler appointed General Franz Bühme as commander-in-chief of all German forces in Serbia. Bühme was Austrian, and he carried something into that role that went beyond professional duty. It was personal. He had grown up in the shadow of the Austro-Hungarian Empire's defeat in World War I, a war largely triggered by a Bosnian Serb assassin. He never forgot it. He never forgave it. When he arrived in Serbia, Bühme issued his own address to his troops. He reminded them of German and Austrian blood spilled on this soil in 1914. He told them they were in a land of treachery. He told them not to hold back. He wasn't ordering soldiers to fight a military enemy. He was pointing a generation of armed men at a civilian population and invoking a 30-year-old grudge as justification. With 3 infantry divisions, the 704th, 714th, and 717th, the killing machine was fully wound up. All it needed was a trigger. It got one in late September 1941. The town of Gornji Milanovac had been surrounded and blockaded by combined Chetnik and partisan forces. On September 29th, those fighters launched a direct assault on the German garrison, which had fortified itself inside the local school building. The fight lasted 90 minutes. When it was over, the resistance withdrew. German casualty count 10 dead, 26 wounded. By any military standard, this was a contained engagement, a skirmish. What happened next was not a military response. It was an accounting session. German officers did not pursue the fighters who had attacked them. Instead, they sat down with Keitel's formula and began doing arithmetic. 10 dead, 101,000 civilian executions required. 26 wounded to 51, 300 civilian executions required. Total to 300 human lives to be destroyed to balance the ledger. The death quota was approved. The 717th Infantry Division was ordered to collect the payment, and they didn't look toward the forests where the fighters had gone. They looked toward the nearest city, Kragujevac, a city of 40,000 people, a city that had nothing to do with the attack at Gornji Milanovac. October 18, 1941 evening, German soldiers surrounded Kragujevac and began moving house to house. Their targets Jewish men and anyone suspected of communist ties. By the end of that night, they had only managed to round up 70 people, 70. Against a quota of 200-300, they needed more, far more. October 19th, the dragnet expanded to surrounding villages, Mikovac, Maridik, Gronika, Militovac. German troops moved through these communities and executed 422 people on the spot. No trials, no hearings, no charges, just the math. Still not enough. October 20th. At dawn, the operation shifted into something that defies easy description. German soldiers flooded into Kragujevac itself, into factories, into markets, into streets, and into schools. Teachers were interrupted mid-lesson. Soldiers walked into classrooms and ordered all male students over 16 to stand and come with them. 300 students and their teachers were marched out of the building. Some teachers were given a choice: leave or stay with your students. They stayed. Roma children who shined shoes on the streets were swept up. Young men buying bread, workers finishing their shifts. Anyone male between roughly 16 and 60 was taken. Local collaborators from the fascist Zbor movement helped sort through the arrested, releasing those they deemed safe nationalists. The rest, labeled communists, Jews, or simply unlucky, stayed in custody, thousands of them. By nightfall, the lists were finalized, October 21, 1941. Before sunrise, the executions began at dawn and continued for 7 straight hours. The victims were divided into groups of 50 to 120 people and marched to open fields outside the city, where the 717th Infantry Division had pre-positioned heavy machine guns. One witness account describes a teacher, surrounded by his students in the field, knowing what was about to happen, who turned to face the guns and shouted, "Keep shooting, I am still teaching." Then the machine guns opened fire. Other groups waiting their turn held hands and sang together, not prayers for mercy, a defiant anthem. When the guns finally went silent after 7 hours, between 778 and 794 people were dead. Among them, 144 high school students and at least 15 victims who were only 12 years old. Then the Germans forced 200 survivors to spend days digging graves and burying the dead, forcing family members to bury their own fathers, brothers, sons. And in the center of the city, still smelling of blood, the German army held a military parade, boots on pavement, a show of power over a people who had just watched their children be shot at a school. Rakyomeng history is patient, but it collects. The 717th Infantry Division, the unit that pulled the triggers at Kragujevac, was later reorganized and sent back into the Balkans, this time to face a partisan resistance that had only grown stronger and more organized. Many of those same soldiers who executed children in a field died anonymously in the mountains and forests of Yugoslavia. No glory, no monument, just an unmarked end. The local Zbor collaborators who helped select which prisoners would die tried to flee to Austria at the end of the war, hoping to surrender to the Western Allies and receive protection. The British handed them back to Yugoslavia. They were executed for treason. General Franz Bumu, the man who had turned personal grievance into mass murder, was eventually captured and charged with war crimes. But before a verdict could be delivered, he chose suicide in his cell. He died without a single word of accountability. He took his guilt with him voluntarily, before history could stamp it on him officially. And then there was Keitel, Wilhelm Keitel, the man who signed the 100-to-1 decree, who formalized state murder with a bureaucratic flourish, was convicted at the Nuremberg trials of crimes against humanity and war crimes. He was sentenced to death by hanging October 16, 1946, the gallows at Nuremberg. What happened next was noted by every reporter in the room and has been discussed ever since. The trapdoor had been designed for a man of average size. Keitel was not average. When the door opened, he fell, but his head struck the wooden frame violently. The impact was severe, and then something worse: the drop had not been calibrated correctly. The noose failed to break his neck instantly. The man who had signed away the lives of thousands of civilians with a pen died convulsing on the rope for 28 minutes. Gasping, struggling, alone in the dark under a trapdoor. 28 minutes. 1 for every 100 lives his decree had swallowed at Kragujevac alone. There is a word that gets used a lot when people talk about the Holocaust and Nazi atrocities: ordinary. The philosophers and historians keep coming back to it. How ordinary people carried out extraordinary evil. How ordinary soldiers loaded rifles and shot children in fields. How ordinary officers sat at desks and did the arithmetic of mass murder. Kragujevac is proof of that word's full weight. The men who marched into those classrooms were not monsters from birth. They were men who had been handed an ideology, given orders, and chose, at every step, not to refuse. The teacher who walked out to die with his students made a choice. The soldiers who shot him made a choice too. That's the hardest part of this history to sit with, because it means the question isn't just about them. It's about what any of us do when the system we're part of starts converting human beings into numbers. Kragujevac asks that question. The mass graves outside that Serbian city ask it. The 12-year-olds who never finished their lessons ask it. The answer, the only acceptable answer, begins with remembering that those numbers were people. This is Timelines of War. If this story mattered to you, subscribe, share it, and hit the bell. The next chapter of history is waiting.